Welcome back. We've been examining the humanitarian crisis facing Sri Lanka as its long-running civil war seems to have come to a close with the defeat of the Tamil Tigers. The desperate situation for the refugees in Sri Lanka comes as the United Nations releases its first global assessment report on disaster risk reduction. The study argues that governments over the world could do much more to save their citizens' lives, particularly as natural disasters affect as many as 200 million people every year. We're speaking with Sir John Holmes, the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, who joins us from New York. Sir John, on this issue of the report, of course, it could be very easy to dismiss this as another sort of academic study by the United Nations that could be, particularly sort of general or vague in terms of its the areas it covers. In your opinion, what makes this report different? Why is it so important?
Well, I think what it shows, it's an invaluable store of analysis and statistics and facts of a kind we haven't had before. What it shows is that the risk of natural disasters, the risk from natural disaster, are increasing rapidly. And that's for a number of reasons. Of course, you have the driver of climate change, which is making more natural disasters related to extreme weather events and more intense disasters. But if you add to that other developments going on in the world, right, rapid urbanization, ecological systems breaking down in terms of water and land availability and people on the edge of subsistence being in danger of being pushed over, then you can see that the effect of these disasters is going to increase. What it also shows, and this is crucial I think, is that the most vulnerable people for disasters are those in the poorest countries. The developing countries tend to be worst affected. They're more affected than the developed countries relatively, both in terms of deaths and economic losses. And it's the poorest groups in those countries who are most at risk. So for all these reasons, we can see that those risks are increasing and that we need to do more about reducing the impacts of those disasters, even if we can't prevent the disasters themselves.
Now, I know that part of the report partly blames weak governance in certain areas for creating this kind of risk, and I wonder, critics might argue that governments can't really control natural conditions when it comes to natural disasters, and I wonder if how that sort of weak governance comes into play. Is it simply a handling of emergency issues, how they handle them post disaster?
Well, I think what we're talking about here, yes, of course, there is a consequence for the way they handle disasters after they happen. But good governance also enables you to prepare for the disasters, to be prepared for them, but also to reduce the impact of them. For example, if you can make sure that people don't live in the most disaster-prone areas, in other words, flood-prone areas in some of the biggest cities of the world, then you reduce the risk of a disaster having dramatic effects on the poorest populations. Developed countries have better systems of doing that. Developing countries are still developing those systems. Therefore, their ability to mitigate the consequences of disasters are bound to be less. And that's why the risks for the poorest, unfortunately, and the most vulnerable are greater than they are in developed countries. And that's the link with governance. Now,
you were mentioning about the increased urbanization, and the report does say that the risk from various disasters has grown considerably in the last couple of decades. I wonder to what degree it's simply that shift of people that's creating pockets of areas that, when affected, obviously have an impact on a much greater population.
Well, it's a combination of things. For example, you have 10 of the biggest cities in the world, which have rapidly become mega cities with populations of 15, 20 million each. They also are very often situated on coast. They're very vulnerable to sea level rise. They're more vulnerable than ever to cyclones, tidal surges, and so on. And again, it's the poorest people in those places which tend to live in the low-lying areas, the areas where no one else wants to live, and who are therefore most vulnerable to these disasters. So the risk of a mega disaster in these mega cities is growing all the time. Again, a reason why we need to invest in mitigating the results of those disasters, the impacts of those disasters before they happen, not just focusing on the consequences and trying to respond after they happen. Investing before is a better investment than investing in the response afterwards. That's the key message.
Has globalization helped to hurt the effort? Is it increasing the risk or reducing it, in your opinion?
I don't think globalization itself has an effect on this. I think it certainly helps the response because people are very aware of the consequences of a disaster. We can use the media to generate resources, to generate interest, to make sure the response is good. But I don't think it's globalization itself which is increasing the risk. It's climate change which is driving the risk. What we need to do is not just think about how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions to try to reduce the effect of global warming in the future, but also deal with the consequences of climate change which are with us right now in terms of these extra disasters. Hurricane seasons which are worse, floods which are worse, and of course droughts which are worse. And that's something which is going to affect large parts of Africa in particular.
Of course, a study such as this takes a long time to put together, to do it so comprehensively. And the world has changed just in the past 6-8 months with certainly the global economic downturn. I wonder what impact that might have on certainly on resources to try to mitigate disasters and reduce the risk.
Well, there may be an effect because it's difficult enough to persuade governments to invest before a disaster happens. You need to persuade a government that they need to invest in measures for something which may happen next year, or it may only happen in 25 years. The only thing you know is that it's going to happen at some stage. So when resources are scarce, that task is more difficult. But I think the economic crisis and the financial crisis, again, will affect the developing countries and the poorest people in those developing countries hardest, even if for the moment it's developed countries where the focus has been. And that is going to increase their risks and their vulnerabilities. It's the combination of all those things which worries us the most.
It's interesting also how the report looks at the idea of natural disasters not necessarily being entirely natural, I guess largely due to climate change and issues that are affected by the way the world population is behaving economically and socially.
I think the point is that you can't stop the natural disasters, but you can make a huge difference to the impact of them. That's within our control. If we have the right natural defences, for example, against tsunamis in terms of mangrove swamps, which are still there on the coastlines rather than destroying them for agricultural reasons, then you increase the protection. That's within our control. That's something we can do. We know what to do. We just have to invest the money and the resources to make it happen.
Yaman is on the line from London. Go ahead, Yaman, your question or comment?
Oh, hi. I am Yanam from London calling.
Hi,
I would like to ask Mr. Holmes about the tsunami disaster which happened in the South Asia.
Right.
During the time, the UN actually gave a lot of money to the Sri Lankan government, but the money never reached to the Tamil people of Sri Lanka.
I guess it's a question here, Sir John, about the distribution of resources and perhaps how the system, the UN system, might be more efficient or more streamlined in ensuring that the right kind of aid gets to the people that it's targeting.
Well, that's what we're always trying to ensure. I think one of the advantageous things of humanitarian assistance is that the expenditure which we conduct, the projects which we put into practice, whether they're from United Nations agencies or NGOs, are actually done directly. We don't hand over the money to governments to do it. We do it ourselves, so we have a reasonably good assurance that the money that is given to us is being used for the purposes for which it was given and is not being diverted. And I think in the case of the tsunami, certainly the UN agencies which were working in Sri Lanka were making sure that it was being distributed properly, including to the Tamil population. Although, of course, there were problems about accessing the LTT held area at the time, because unlike, for example, in Indonesia, the conflict was not put aside to allow the relief effort to continue.
Are there any scientific innovations, Sir John, that could be highlighted that are actually helping the situation, perhaps reducing the risk of disasters?
Well, what we can do, I mean, the most obvious way of disaster risk reduction, or the most obvious type of disaster risk reduction, is making buildings earthquake-proof in earthquake-prone areas. And that's not only a question of building codes, it's a question of enforcing them. And we saw, for example, in China, that the codes were there, but perhaps the practice wasn't as good, so that there was a collapse of many schools and other public buildings. One of the campaigns we're conducting at the moment is to say to countries, invest in making your schools and your hospitals particularly safe against the disasters to which your area is prone. It may be flooding, it may be earthquakes, it may be volcanoes, whatever it may be. That's a very good investment. If you build it into the system when you're building it, the extra cost is very small.
With 30 seconds to go, just a thought, is there anything individuals can do when it comes to reducing such risks?
I think individuals and local communities have a hugely important role to play in knowing what the risks are in their area and guarding against them, making sure they have the right early warning systems. If you look at Bangladesh, that's what they've done incredibly successfully, having the early warning system. So the death toll from, for example, cyclones in the Bangladesh Delta is much smaller than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
So John, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. On the next show, US President Barack Obama promised to close the Guantanamo Bay prison by January of next year, but that target seems uncertain after his decision to revive the military commission's trials held there. So will Gitmo finally be shut down? We'll take a look, and you can join the debate with your questions and comments. Hope you'll join us for that. But from me and the team, we'll see you next time.